Max Blumenthal is an award-winning journalist and best-selling author. I mean, you've seen his work. You've seen it in the LA Times, New York Times. He has a book that's been best-selling in both of those papers. He wrote the book, The Republican Gomorrah Inside the Movement That Shattered the Party. He also just this month came out with Goliath, Life and Loathing in Greater Israel. And you've seen it in the news. Everyone's talking about it. And Glenn Greenwald just wrote an amazing review of the book in Amazon. He spent over 4 years of his life to work on this book. He traveled to Jaffa, Jerusalem, Al-Quds, Ramallah, spent so many years in this region. And all this information he's put into this amazing book that's been receiving rave reviews. And also Max has been on the forefront for exposing the international network of Islamophobes. We are honored to have him join us this evening in Santa Clara. Without further ado, Max Blumenthal.
Thanks, Bassem. Can everyone hear me okay? I hope this water balances here, all right? It's really a massive honor to be with you tonight, to be with CAIR, an organization I've followed throughout my journalistic career. I've watched the work you guys have done, and I really consider you to be on the front lines of democracy, defending basic rights that we should be able to take for granted of Americans and of people, of immigrants, of longtime Americans. I believe that you're defending my rights in a struggle that my own family went through at the turn of the century when we immigrated here. So it's just a massive honor to be the speaker, and I'm a little bit humbled. That's why I asked not to be called the keynote speaker. It's also coming on stage after Imam Siraj is a hard act to follow. I want to start out by apologizing to CAIR for, I think this is the first year in a while you haven't wound up on the Anti-Defamation League's blacklist of anti-Israel organizations. Sorry, it's a badge of honor to wind up with such great groups like Jewish Voice for Peace and Students for Justice in Palestine, which is having their, that's right, we can applaud. These are really some of the bravest people in our country. They're just down the road here. I was at their cultural event last night. I saw the biggest Debka line I've ever seen in my life. I can do a horror line, but that was a little too complex for me. It's an honor to be on the same stage that my friend Glenn Greenwald was on. I'm told that, standing here, it's like a lucky charm, and some of the things that happened to Greenwald after he stood on this stage might happen to me. He's definitely more prominent since then, but I heard he signed up for some CAIR events in the future, and he may not be able to attend them because he's afraid of returning to the United States. So I don't know if that will happen to me or not. At least if I can wind up in Brazil, that would be a good consolation. But it's actually disturbing. I mean, I'm a little young. I'm 35. I don't really remember when we had free speech here. So maybe some of you older folks remember. I don't know. Siraj, I don't know if you remember, or maybe not. Now, I do have a book for sale. I'm on book tour. And I have gotten some good reviews, as Bassem mentioned. I've also gotten some bad reviews. There are currently, I think, 60 one-star reviews on my Amazon page in 2 weeks from unverified users who haven't read the book but have reviewed the DVD of Hot Tub Time Machine and things that are completely unrelated to the Israel-Palestine conflict. So clearly there's a campaign to suppress the discussion and to suppress the facts that I presented in my book, Goliath, which are about what's really happening behind the cordon of silence in this country around the issue of Israel-Palestine. And my book is for sale here. CAIR has already bought the book. So basically, when you buy the books, and I'll sign them for you, you're contributing to CAIR. So this is another way you can contribute to this great organization. And one of the points that I make in my book, one of the things I seek to elucidate, is that the what we know of as the Israel-Palestine conflict is not a religious conflict. It's not a conflict over religion. It is a conflict over basic rights, including the basic rights of an indigenous people who have been dispossessed over the last 65 years and deprived of their basic rights and even defined as infiltrators. I'm going to get into this term. We're going to hear this term a lot tonight as I talk about Islamophobia. And that these people should have a right to return as Syrian refugees do, as Congolese refugees do, as all refugees do. This is a basic human right, and we have to make sure that that is enshrined, that this right enshrined in international law is honored. But unfortunately, there are people in the region who are trying to define it as a religious conflict, even though Palestinians are a diverse community of Christians and even atheists and Muslims. And it's not just Hamas, by the way. I've been attacked by a fellow writer at The Nation magazine who has named my book the book of the month for the Hamas Book Club. So welcome to the Hamas Book Club, or more appropriately, the Hamas Book Club. But it's not just Hamas, it's also the government of Benjamin Netanyahu, which has recently endorsed a ban on the call of the muezzin in Jaffa, which is in the Tel Aviv municipality. And it reminds me of a lot of the fights we hear in this country over something we take for granted, again, the First Amendment. Netanyahu has sought to redefine the U.S.-Israel relationship, which used to be defined as kind of two supposed democracies with shared values, into two countries fighting a war of civilizations, two Fort Apaches on the front line against the barbaric masses, those he has defined as, or called, the insatiable crocodile of militant Islam. So he has really been instrumental in fueling this Islamophobic network I'm going to talk about, and so have many of his funders. But it's not just a right-wing phenomenon. It is a phenomenon we're seeing increasingly across the board in our political spectrum. Since 9/11, this phenomenon has spiked, but it was really there was one decisive event that drove Islamophobic attitudes in the United States, and it was the killing of Osama bin Laden. Obviously, there's no debate that bin Laden deserved punishment for his evil acts, but the reaction shook me up and surprised me, and it's been explained in an Ohio State poll in 2011, which found that after 9/11, actually half of Americans still defined Muslims as trustworthy, quote-unquote trustworthy, but after bin Laden's death, only 1/3 did. Public opposition to racial and religious profiling dropped dramatically after the killing of bin Laden. And 1 in 3 Americans agreed with this statement: Muslims are mostly responsible for creating the religious tension that exists in the United States today. The number of those unwilling to have Muslim friends doubled to 20%, and most disturbingly, 24% of self-identified liberals claimed that Muslims made the U.S. more dangerous. The pollster who conducted this poll of attitudes wrote, liberals and moderates essentially converge towards conservatives in their attitudes about Muslim Americans. So clearly we have a lot of work to do here. This is just a 2-year-old poll, and clearly these attitudes are not just being advanced by right-wing radio hosts who warn that God, or who hope that God will kill Allah, but by people like Bill Maher, who are identified as liberals. And I just watched Bill Maher's show 2 nights ago, and he declared that Islam is the singular threat to civilization. This is the same person who donated $1 million, set up a super PAC to donate $1 million to Barack Obama. So what's going on here? There's a lot going on. Definitely there's a right-wing, organized right-wing campaign to demonize Muslims and to strip them of their rights. But there is also problem among liberals and within the Democratic Party, within a community that I come from. Both of my parents worked in the Clinton administration. I know this community well. And this is partly a moral failure on the part of Barack Obama, who, as far as I know, has not visited a single mosque since he's been elected president. George W. Bush visited mosques. Why can't Barack Obama? Barack Obama, maybe I'm wrong and you can correct me. I don't know about this. Barack Obama also has pandered more than any president in the United States to Benjamin Netanyahu, who lectures him in public in front of the Washington press corps and humiliates him. And he uses disturbing racially charged rhetoric defending Israel's security imperatives because it's in a quote-unquote dangerous neighborhood. This rhetoric has disturbing undertones in the United States. And it's especially disturbing to hear it from the first African-American president. Now consider, as Ali Abu Nema, the founder of the essential online news portal Electronic Intifada, did, how Barack Obama described the still unsolved attack on Israeli tourists in Bulgaria in August 2012. He called it a barbaric terrorist attack on Israelis. He said attacks against innocent civilians, including children, are completely outrageous, and that Israel has tragically once more been a target of terrorism. A very vehement statement, and of course, no one should be victimized by terrorism as these people were, but consider how Obama described the shooting spree carried out by a white racist U.S. Army veteran in July 2012 at a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, a house of worship that the shooter mistook for a mosque. He wanted to kill Muslims. And as we know, Sikhs have typically, since 9/11, functioned as a stand-in for Islamophobes and racists who know nothing of their religion and are seeking to target Muslims. Barack Obama said, we need to do some soul searching and see how we can examine additional ways that we can reduce violence. And what I found to be a rather tepid statement, not defining this deliberate act of hate aimed at an entire community as an act of terrorism. So Obama is indeed a historic president, not just because he's the first African-American president. He's also the first president to pledge to fight, quote-unquote, delegitimization, which is a code word for Palestine solidarity activism. So he's not just pledged to fight terror, as Bush did. He's pledged to fight nonviolent activities. He's the first president to have a kill list, which happens to have resulted in what a new UN report describes as a campaign of drone attacks that have left hundreds of civilians dead in Pakistan, and which Amnesty International says may amount to war crimes. One of the most disturbing episodes in the Obama era was something that I documented in a story that I wrote for Electronic Intifada. It's one of the few websites that was willing to give me the editorial space and the resources necessary to do this kind of investigation, and it occurred after the Boston bombings. At the interfaith ceremony in Boston. And Imam Suhaib Webb was scheduled to speak at this interfaith ceremony. This is a major religious figure, as someone you probably all know. I think he's the head of the second largest mosque in the United States. Deval Patrick, the governor, who is sort of a protege of Obama, was presiding over the ceremony. He himself, I think, is a Baptist minister. And Barack Obama was himself going to be there, and all of a sudden there was a campaign of right-wing pressure, citing debunked, bogus research from the Anti-Defamation League and right-wing groups, naming Suhaib Webb as a mole or an infiltrator with ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, completely false, and he was promptly replaced by an unknown figure with no religious authority and no theological background named Nasser Widadi. And I was disturbed by this episode, and I wondered what was going on here. Who is Widadi? Who's your Widadi? I found that he came from an organization called the American Islamic Congress, an organization I had not heard of before. And I called up my friend Eli Clifton, who's a great journalist, who produced the seminal was among the researchers who produced the seminal Center for American Progress report on Islamophobia, Fear Incorporated, which this excellent report draws from, and who was soon drummed out of his position by right-wing pro-Israel elements, along with every other researcher but one, drummed out of a major liberal think tank in Washington. And Eli provided me with 990 forms for the American Islamic Congress, this unknown organization. And I found that they were heavily, heavily funded, not just by the State Department, but by right-wing Islamophobic donors like Sheldon Adelson, who happens to be one of the biggest funders of Benjamin Netanyahu, and one of the biggest funders of the pro-war neoconservative Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. I found that they were funded by a who's who of funders of the Islamophobia industry that are named in Legislating Fear, this report, and that they had created this Muslim organization in order to replace established Muslim organizations like CAIR and divide the Muslim community, and that it had played out in this interfaith ceremony. I found that they had been a key supporter of the invasion of Iraq and were funded by the State Department to train Iraqi women in democracy. And when I read the report, I saw that one of their key accomplishments was teaching women to sneeze into their arm instead of their hand because it can spread germs that way. So they didn't accomplish very much in Iraq except providing moral cover for Bush's invasion. So we have to see that this goes far beyond the Islamophobic network as we understand it and goes into the heart of the Muslim community with these kind of organizations. And it goes into the liberal political establishment and the Democratic Party as well. It's why I'm really heartened to see so many elected officials here tonight who have resisted this tide. But as I mentioned, it is also a campaign of organized right-wing resentment, mobilization of resentment against Muslims, and that Barack Obama is largely responding to this campaign through overcompensation. It is right-wingers who are driving this discourse of Muslims as enemies within. And the key base for this campaign is the evangelical religious right. There are lots of great evangelicals who are doing incredible work in the Middle East, who are doing incredible work, interfaith work in this country. But then there are those like Pastor John Hagee who are declaring that Jerusalem is the landing pad for the Messiah, and that all who are failed to convert in the end times will burn in an everlasting lake of fire. And so I think burning in a lake of fire would not be so pleasant, but if it's everlasting, I might get used to it for a while. I just join all of you in solidarity when we get into the lake of fire, because I don't think we're going to be converting. Hagee, well, let's go back to the 2004 election, since I don't have all night. This was an election I thought was going to be decided on the war on Iraq and the war on terror. But when the exit polls came out, we saw that most voters were deciding many of the key voters were value voters who had voted on the issue of same-sex marriage. And it was the gays that they were afraid of, and not, in fact, Iraqis or Al-Qaeda. Now, we've seen that campaign against the LGBT community increasingly fizzle out as same-sex marriage is legalized in state after state after state. And Barack Obama has been a strong voice in favor of marriage equality, to his credit. So there's a transition within the Christian right from anti-gay politicking to anti-Muslim politicking. And I've seen it on this book tour that I'm currently on, because on November 9th, I'm speaking at the Phoenix chapter of CAIR, and a group called the Florida Family Association, a Christian right group, has tried to shut down that event and my talk by applying pressure on the Hilton hotel chain. This is a group that has also attempted to pressure advertisers to pull out of the All-American Muslim reality show that is called, tried to get Al Jazeera taken off American TV. And I looked on their website and I found out that this group was founded as an anti-gay organization, not an anti-Muslim organization, and that they are obsessed with a video game, a Star Wars video game that supposedly portrays gay stormtroopers holding hands. And they have attempted to warn about this video game, along with warning about my presence at CAIR in Phoenix. So we see a rapidly transforming, rightward trending Republican base, which is fertile soil for a campaign that's been waged since 9/11, and which has been accelerated since Obama's election. Of course, Obama has been demonized as the top secret Muslim, with millions in money funneled strategically from right-wing and pro-Israel foundations. I wrote about one of these foundations, which actually isn't mentioned in here, headed by a woman named Nina Rosenwald, who basically created the career of Daniel Pipes, who has basically made the work of memory possible. Look in here and see these organizations, but also has been on the board of AIPAC, the key arm of the Israel lobby, and on JINSA, another pro-Israel group which has taken thousands of American police officers and federal law enforcement officials to training sessions from Israeli security forces. And so these funders have supported the career of a very small group of right-wing demagogues like David Horowitz, the former Stalinist who turned to the far right and has really coined the phrase Islamofascism, or tried to patent that phrase. And when I get into, I'm going to talk about Egypt a little later, and we're going to hear that phrase kind of reemerge. Pam Geller, who many of you know with her extremely bigoted advertisements and campaigns against Muslims, she's called me a Jewicidal jihadi. So, you know, it's another badge of honor I'm happy to wear. And Robert Spencer, her partner at Stop the Islamicization of America, which is funded by David Horowitz through these donors. Spencer was named over 100 times in the manifesto of Anders Breivik, the right-wing terrorist who killed over 70 Norwegians in a terror spree he said was aimed at killing those who supported immigrant rights and pro-immigration policies. And we also see people like Zuhdi Jasser, who is a self-identified Muslim, warning about Muslim Brotherhood front groups and terrorist front groups in the mainstream Muslim community. Now, many of you are familiar with these people, and you can acquaint yourself with them in this report. And there's this excellent chart that comes with the report, which makes it really accessible. I feel like the reverse Glenn Beck with this chart, mainly because it's actually factual. You can call me Max Beckenthal. But one of the most important figures who I want to talk about is Stephen Emerson. He's sort of discredited now because he's shopped his journalism around as FBI reports, which was false. But it's Emerson who was really essential ever since the 90s in advancing the concept of Muslims as a terrorist fifth column, burrowing within American society. Zara mentioned how this has roots in McCarthyism. The idea that communists were burrowing within the State Department and the U.S. Army. This is the same rhetoric and the same false charges, and they're doing the same amount of damage to our social and political fabric. But Emerson, you know, has gotten popular. He did a documentary series for PBS all the way back in the 90s about how terrorists were living among us. He wrote a book called Terrorists Among Us. And he was a key bridge between the FBI and certain local law enforcement agencies because he had great contacts within law enforcement who took him seriously as a self-styled terror expert. If you look at the post-9/11 prosecutions, many of the prosecutors actually followed the lead that Emerson set in his books when he claimed that, for example, Sami al-Arian, this is a completely false claim that's been discredited, was the key fundraiser for Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And Sami al-Arian is now still waiting for some verdict. He was put on trial, and his lawyers didn't even offer a closing statement. They said, our closing statement is the First Amendment because he's being put on trial for invective, not actual things he's done. The Holy Land Foundation was another group that Emerson spent years targeting and drumming up false information about. This was a group that was possibly one of the largest Muslim foundations in the country. Its directors are now in prison essentially for life. And what did they do? They were not put on trial for being any operational involvement in terrorist activities. They were put on trial for charity, sending charity to the Gaza Strip, which is under siege, which is now where people receive their food through tunnels. And these organizations that they sent charity to were also receiving funding from the Red Cross and USAID. Their prosecution was incredibly disturbing and set a terrible precedent. And so we see that words have consequences. Rhetoric has consequences. The kind of rhetoric we hear from Geller and Emerson about enemies from within doesn't only have consequences in the attacks we've seen on Muslim houses of worship, or the common bigotry we see in public school classrooms, where students who wear hijab are singled out. It has consequences in the attitude of federal law enforcement and even local law enforcement. And we've seen hundreds of cases of entrapment, of bogus prosecutions, where someone is targeted who may be mentally ill, like Ahmed Farhani recently was in New York. This is an 18-year-old who is mentally ill, mentally unstable, was put on trial after agreeing to carry out a plot that was furnished to him by an FBI agent, an FBI snitch, who was initially sent in to New York to spy on the Palestinian solidarity community and the Palestinian activist community. When he failed to find any criminal activity there, he found a kid who was basically desperate and had mental problems, and this kid is now on trial for his life. And we see this over and over and over again. It's elucidated in the mentality of David Cohen, who is now currently the head of the NYPD's intelligence division and who has been exposed in the incredible new book, Enemies Within, by Adam Goldman and Matt Apuzzo, which you should all read. Here's what David Cohen said in the mid-90s when he was CIA director about about Islamic terror. They escape detection by blending into society. They may own homes, live in communities with families, belong to religious or social organizations, and attend educational institutions. They typically display enormous patience, often waiting years until the components of their plans are perfectly aligned. And so what we see him doing is casting suspicion on an entire community, not for behaving like violent terrorists, but for behaving like everyday Americans. And this goes to the heart of the fear of the axis of Islamophobia. The fear is not extremist activity. The fear is assimilation. That Muslims will declare themselves Americans with essential rights, and they will challenge institutions like Abercrombie and Fitch. And let me say something about why it's so important that Abercrombie and Fitch was challenged, because they have catalogs that go out to hundreds of thousands of people, and they try to define what an American looks like. And they have tried to define Americans as white and blonde and thin, and that is not what America looks like. This is what America looks like. This is my America. So we see someone with this mentality put in a powerful but shadowy position with very few legal regulations. Under the watch of Ray Kelly, the NYPD police chief, who is the godfather of the stop and frisk policy, which had a quota for African-American males who would be stopped on the street and frisked and even arrested. He's a former CIA chief. And he is also clearly, as if you read Enemies Within, influenced by pro-Israel ideology, which has very little to do with American values. Cohen set up a demographics unit. This is Israeli-style rhetoric because Israel is one of the only countries in the world which seeks to manipulate and engineer demographics in its favor. And the AP, the Associated Press, reported that this unit openly declared that it sought to map out and monitor Muslim communities in New York as Israel does the West Bank, as Israel controls and dominates an occupied territory. Cohen created, through his mapping system, classifications, 28 ancestries of interest, including quote-unquote black Muslim. He monitored Muslim students outside New York City at Rutgers University, was actually busted by a janitor who wandered into an empty dorm room filled with terrorist literature, which was actually being used by the NYPD, which was reporting to the FBI. He's kept records through the demographics unit of food at halal spots around New York. And this may be, serve as kind of a Zagat guide for halal restaurants. And he's documented the watching of Al Jazeera at these restaurants, as if this is sort of relevant. And what he's failed to do is unpack any real terrorist plots or threat to New York City. Instead, he's placed an entire community under suspicion and disrupted the lives of thousands of people, sending plants into events like this even. I don't know if there are any plants here, but I tell you what I do with plants is I pour water on them and I tell them to grow up. And the prosecutions continue. I want to tell you about a really important case going on right now and a name that you should remember because we can't allow this to pass. In Chicago, a community leader, a 66-year-old woman named Rasmia Odeh from the Arab Action Network, is about to be deported by the Department of Homeland Security to an unknown location because she is a stateless individual. They claim that she lied on her immigration papers that she didn't report that she spent 10 years in an Israeli prison for participating in a bombing over 30 years ago. It turns out that she was, in fact, in an Israeli prison. She did her time assigned to her by the state of Israel, and she was horribly tortured and sexually abused in that prison, and she is now a key part of the social fabric of Chicago. She's helped the lives of her neighbors, and she has nowhere to go. And so I don't know what crime she's really accused of, how she's dangerous to our society, or why she should be deported, but I think we need to start lobbying, because she has not been deported yet, to make sure that this doesn't happen. And I also want to tell you about, and we can talk about how to do that the NYPD doesn't just monitor Muslims, it actually has a Palestine file. I've learned about this through lawyers who are trying to combat what may be illegal activities carried out by the NYPD, and this is all part of the criminalization of Palestine solidarity activism that we see afoot in this country. And so, is this an American phenomenon? Is this distinctly American? I think we see it happening overseas. This is an era of globalization, and this phenomenon has been imported and exported from country to country to country. And one of the most bizarre episodes I saw recently was the Muslim Brotherhood from within conspiracy theory. Now, I want to quote to you a TV host who I watched recently, who said, "The issue is not whether Obama is a member of the Muslim Brotherhood or not. The issue is that it is a fact that Obama used the help of the Muslim Brotherhood in his administration." And this TV host went on to name a host of individuals, including Salam Mariyati and Mohammed Ali Biari, who's a Department of Homeland Security official, and Abu Patel, the Muslim columnist, as Muslim Brotherhood infiltrators in government. "Write these names down," he said. "Look them up during the break, and when I come back, let me know if what I say is wrong." This was not an American right-wing host. This was an Egyptian TV host in Cairo for a network called On TV, which is owned by the wealthiest man in Egypt, Naguib Sawiris. And he was recycling a conspiracy theory first introduced by the brilliant minds of Representatives Louis Gohmert and Michelle Bachmann, whose conspiracy attempt to indict the Obama administration for this conspiracy completely fizzled out, but it of course forced figures like Ali Biari, who actually was serving in government, to undergo humiliating background check after background check to prove that these allegations were not true. And so they have gone back to Egypt after the coup of July 3rd. They have formed a kind of tea party on the Nile. And Ali Biari explained why this happened to me. He said these stories spread like wildfire to explain why Obama wasn't with them, why Obama was not with the military coup regime of Egypt, which had removed the elected government of Mohamed Morsi. He said that the opposition, these groups, claimed they were the true representatives of the people. And the opposition, by the way, was funded by Naguib Sawiris, and the Tamarod movement you heard was funded by Naguib Sawiris. But since they're anti-Morsi, that Obama should be with them in overthrowing Morsi. And so when they went searching for reasons why Obama wasn't doing that, it had to be because he was either Muslim Brotherhood himself or he was misled by MB operatives. And so we've seen these conspiracy theories gain strength in Egypt through people like Bassem Youssef, who is considered to be the Egyptian Jon Stewart and sort of a voice of reason in Egypt, who went out and declared after the coup that the Muslim Brotherhood were the Nazis of today, that they were Nazis. This was a campaign of dehumanization that was carried out under the banner of Egypt United Against Terrorism, a slogan that flashed on private networks every 5 minutes like On TV, but was hung up in banners in the street above the glowing image of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the head of this coup regime. United Against Terrorism. Now, where have we heard that rhetoric before? It reminded me of post-9/11 the U.S. It reminded me of my time inside Israel. And we slowly saw the death of electoral democracy backed by self-identified Egyptian liberals and business elites exploiting conspiracy theories that emanated from the American Tea Party. Bizarre, I know, but it had devastating and incredibly disturbing consequences, because this rhetoric was used to dehumanize the protesters who were Morsi supporters, who had taken to the streets and set up a protest encampment in Rabaa, the Cairo neighborhood, and were slaughtered, over 1,000, inside a field hospital. And so we see, I think here, the ultimate and most disturbing effect of Islamophobic rhetoric, which is designed to dehumanize people, conveniently dehumanize people, which is that this regime that slaughtered these protesters gained popularity under the banner of United Against Terrorism and through this rhetoric. We see it in Europe increasingly, as the party that Anders Breivik, the Islamophobic terrorist, belonged to, has won elections in Norway, the Popular Party. And we see it in the Netherlands, where Geert Wilders, who has proposed banning the Quran and sending Muslims away on trains, is gaining popularity and deciding the political future of the next government. We see it in the Golden Dawn in Greece, a member of the Golden Dawn recently stabbed to death an anti-racist rapper in Greece. We see it in the Jobbik Party in Hungary, and we see it in the deportation of Roma, carried out not only by right-wing governments, but by the liberal government of François Hollande in France. We see it in the boats sinking in the Mediterranean, the boats of migrants seeking to escape warfare in North Africa and poverty to Europe, and who meet a closed door because they've been demonized as subhuman. And we see it in this international network of Islamophobes and right-wingers who are forming against a world that is changing in a way that they can't control, a kind of change that is embodied in this room. We see the past uniting against the future in a fighting retreat, and it's not going to be pretty. Dark days could be ahead, but we can see hope here in this room, and we can see it down the street at the Students for Justice in Palestine conference, where young people have signed up to be president of these Palestine Solidarity chapters at their universities and colleges, knowing that will be on their resume. And many young people are doing things knowing that it will be on their resume and that they will be judged accordingly. And this in itself is a courageous act, and it also shows faith in freedom, that the future is going to be different than now. We're going to enjoy a future that's more tolerant and more open, and that the forces that have aligned against it will ultimately not only be vanquished, but humiliated to the point where they'll join us. Those forces for now are trying to extend the arc of history that points to justice, and what you have already done is ensure that it doesn't bend in the other direction. So let's be mindful that the darkest hour comes before the dawn, and let's lead the way. Thank you.